So thanks for taking time to talk about data. Tony, great to have you join.
Hey, it's a pleasure to see you again, Tim.
As always, as always. Laura, why don't you take a minute and introduce yourself?
Laura Sellers, Chief Product Officer for Collibra.
Great. Irfan, great to see you as well.
I'd like to see you too as well. So Irfan Khan, I'm the Chief Product Officer for HANA Database and Analytics Portfolio for SAP.
Great. Tony, we've talked about data quite a bit. Today there was some conversation around the way that the partnership is coming together. Let's start with how enterprises are using data and how that's evolving. So Irfan, do you want to start us off in terms of how you're seeing that change in data use evolve?
Yeah, it's a really good question, but if you look at the answer to the question, it's not necessarily a new answer. Over the course of the last probably, I would say, 10, if not 15 years, there's been a significant amount of innovation, but potentially in silos of innovation. We see, for example, in the data tier, if you look at the storage, the streaming side, you look at the persistent side, in each one of those foundations, there's been a hell of a lot of innovation work that's gone on. But what ultimately has been happening is that customers have been forced to really bring their data to the technology, which in part creates part of the issue which they have to then deal with, which is how do you then govern the data? How do you ensure that you integrate with the data sets that have now been either pulled out or extracted? And therefore the problem in itself becomes more of a perpetual problem that needs to be then solved. Because of course with the pandemic and with the discretionary IT spend becoming even more scrutinized, where we see that the data challenge of most customers originates from the manner in which data is essentially either broadcasted, the way it's shared, or the way it's sometimes used, but without the context that it was originally designed with.
What are some of the ways that maybe customers aren't thinking about data that maybe they should? Laura?
That's a loaded question. I think as I think through the answer to that, I think the biggest thing is, we've been talking about it for years, that data volumes just continue to grow, and everyone wants to figure out how to make data a strategic asset in their organization, but they're really not going about it the right way and understanding where all the data is, all the context that goes with that data. And so as they've kind of continued through that life cycle that started many years ago from Hadoop to now data lakes, as all of that transition has happened, it's really been going, we need all of our data, but how are we getting value out of that data? And giving them an interface that allows them to really understand, trust, and understand where that source is, the data lineage is coming from, is hugely important for our customers as they move forward. I think the majority of data inside an organization is never utilized at all.
Yeah, seems like the more things change, the more they remain the same.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of brings us to a point of what you folks were here talking about today. SAP has been traditionally known as an island of data, whereas Collibra, your specialty is working with islands of data. So what is this new relationship or this new partnership that you're just discussing today? What is that going to mean to the customer? And at the same time, what does that mean for you two as companies in terms of how you work together?
Well, I think first and foremost, we're super excited to have Collibra in the SAP data ecosystem. By definition, Collibra is a market leader. And we see, whilst you describe them as islands of information and islands of data, it's the fabric of most IT organizations. Seldom would you find one single owner of all the data that resides within an enterprise, or for any enterprise for that matter, right? Enterprise to enterprise type of interactions. So with Collibra being the market leader that it is, and having spent substantial levels of effort and time and research and development into managing all the disparate sources of data, of which SAP is a very significant part of most customers' landscapes, the operational data of SAP, more often than not, will be used to contextualize much of the machine learning that goes on, perhaps a lot of the forecasting or the demand planning that may go on. So we look at this as a relationship where we have the genesis of helping, firstly, customers go the last mile of integrating all of the data together, using the core capabilities of Collibra, whether that's in the lineage aspect, whether it's in the data privacy space, the cataloging, the governance. You wrap it all together, and then you put the SAP data foundation into that mix. And then, of course, from a bi-directional perspective, we are generating a lot of data products, and equally so, we want to consume lots of data products. So it's a symbiotic opportunity and relationship between not just Collibra, but many of the other ecosystem partnerships that we also want to drive. But in particular with Collibra, it gives us a real value add right now.
So I'm a customer that kind of delves into this. How should I be thinking differently about how I approach data and approach this partnership before, but then also during the process of starting to leverage it?
I think that, we have many customers. I've said our mission is to make data a strategic asset for any organization so they can drive better business outcomes. And as a customer who has been with Collibra and has been with SAP, this is really about how are we providing more context to SAP data, the ability to more easily ingest that data, ingest more of the metadata that goes with it. But I also think we have a big opportunity around data lineage, as we mentioned, and truly understanding how that data is being transformed, where it's going, where it's flowing to in and out of, as we think through impact analysis, impact radius. If you want to go change part of the data, where is it going to flow throughout? So a lot of this has been harder with SAP over the years through some of the basic connectors we have, and it's really about going deeper so people have a better understanding of everything that's happening inside their SAP ecosystem, as well as all the other data ecosystems where they have things stored.
And is that maybe an opportunity too? Because the reality is, even though I'm an SAP customer, I am going to have data sitting in other places. Mm-hmm. So is there an opportunity of connecting that data instead of having it, kind of to your point about islands, using the term islands, instead of having it siloed or out on islands, to potentially bring it together? That
is definitely Collibra's whole vision and mission, is to be able to do that across the entire data ecosystem inside your enterprise or inside your organization. So we do everything from that ability to catalog all of your systems, add context to them across all of those systems. We have the data lineage tied to it. We have data privacy tied to it. We also are doing data access governance, as well as data quality as something else. We want to make sure you're able to truly trust the data that's flowing through the systems.
I'd like to take a step on that, which is that traditionally, when we think of basically umbrella versus best-of-breed solutions, that with umbrella, okay, there's a certain simplicity to that, but of course, then you take some compromises. The best-of-breed, of course, is what it says. It's like Collibra, you're the best-of-breed in governance. So, and I'd like to ask both of you, how do you make this process of bringing the two together simpler, both in terms of how you deliver the solution and how you integrate the solution?
I think first and foremost it's a cultural change. And I think Laura would also testify to this, that SAP historically, and with some level of transparency, probably has not been the easiest foundation to be able to extract data from with context. Getting data out is not a problem. Many customers have been doing it for years and years. But trying to retain the context becomes a real challenge. And in many ways, if you look at the history of SAP, it was not done as a consequence of making it difficult for customers or partners. It was done because that's how the architecture was defined. I mean, to give you some simplistic explanation here, SAP's had a programming language called ABAP for approaching 40 years now. In fact, this is the 40th anniversary year. And within the context of that, there used to be a data dictionary. So imagine that you've got this very significant homogeneous data model of SAP with the data dictionary, and it makes it extremely easy to be able to go to that one single homogeneous model and then know exactly what artifacts are available, how to either introduce more content to them or integrate with them. But that over time has, of course, become more challenged, right? Because SAP, of course, has grown very inorganically over the last 10 years. Take a look at SuccessFactors with 250 odd million subscribers that are using that service. And similarly with Concur and Ariba and all the others. So the data ecosystem of SAP is no longer just in the old ABAP world of SAP and the ERP. It now broadens the scope into many, many different areas. So this is now when we look at the last mile requirements of many customers. They want SAP context, but they also want to contextualize it with all the SAP ecosystem, and then look at the broader non-ERP stroke SAP ecosystem. And I think this is where Collibra has really cemented its place as being a market leader. Putting aside the best of breed tag or the best of suite, whatever it might be, it's really a marriage of values that culminates together to give customers a truer, simplified pathway to success. And that's really the way we look at it.
Right. Let's put the onus on Laura here, because you work with SAP, you work with other partners. What is it that you have to deliver to make this a reality? To make
I think it's we've got our joint product roadmap going forward as far as working tightly with our engineering and product teams to make sure this is as seamless of an integration as possible to get as much context out of SAP as possible. So we're really working closely with our customers, getting more and more requirements from them every day as far as how how are we going to bring the most value for them so they can get the most out of their data to be able to make decisions quickly.
So let me come back to something you said, because you were talking about culture, and you went down the path of talking about culture within SAP. But is there a culture change that needs to happen within customers too, and how they think about data?
I think so. I mean, I'm glad you picked up on that point, because culture in itself, just because muscle memory dictates that you need to move something away from something else, subtract something in order to have greater value, is perhaps a mindset change that needs to be addressed here. And what I mean by that is, if you have, for example, in an SAP system today, an order entry process that has, at the end of the process chain, an invoice that needs to be generated for an end customer, but the data products themselves will essentially be able to model the entirety of the supply chain if you choose to do so. Mm-hmm. It could give you a high level of insight around what the supply chain is giving you as maybe patterns of repeatability, churn factor, and all sorts. But if you pull the subset of the data out and you rely upon that in isolation, you miss the bigger picture view. Mm-hmm. So I think culturally, it's as much as the evolution in mindset that retaining business context and being able to do so now, even if you want to move partly the data out or ingest data from other sources, this is something that needs to change in people's minds now, because discretionary IT spend, as I said earlier on, is no longer there. Who wants to spend all their time just integrating data for the sake of integrating it, and then having a small boutique number of these reports that could be generated for a small niche number of the customers or the internal stakeholders? It doesn't give you the full value.
Well, and we already know integration has become a nightmare within the enterprise, right? It was great to swing the pendulum to the best of breed and create those interconnects in data, but at some point that becomes an exponential problem. Mm-hmm. Each additional component you add in now becomes an exponential integration problem to have to contend with. And so consolidation with still maintaining context is really important in data. And so I think this is something that I find really interesting with this partnership is when you're living in the SAP ecosystem, that's one thing. But let's be honest, enterprises don't live just within one vendor's ecosystem, right? Hence why your company exists.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, Tim, with your analogy there of the ecosystem of just SAP, even though it's a component of the customer's landscape, it's considered to be a very high value component of the landscape.
Of course.
And I would just be very conscious of making one final quick point here on this topic is the notion of having a business data fabric, which is ultimately what we're trying to define here, means that it's not as if this is an SAP only service that we're providing or an SAP only value add that we're providing. Any downstream or upstream consumer or producer of content that wants to rationalize SAP has an easier, simplified way now through the business data fabric. And that in itself is a value add that I think most customers would see benefits in. And certainly working with Collibra, we feel as if this is now the right time and culturally the right fit for us to now be able to extend not just the hand of partnership, but the arm of partnership and any other limb that you choose to take, right, to make sure that this really becomes tangible.
I think, go ahead, I'm sorry, Laura.
Oh, no, I was going to add, because you mentioned the culture side of it, whether it's an SAP culture or a customer culture thing, and I think we still have a long way to go on a data culture really being a real component of enterprises, and I think really combined between Collibra and SAP, we have a duty to really help drive data literacy across the organization, which is kind of this whole story around context and how are we making it easy for people to be able to understand and find data so they can start to actually make real business decisions. But I think we definitely need to help drive that data literacy inside the organization more and more as we.
I think that's really interesting because it was an interesting discussion that we had in the session earlier, and you could sort of see the different perspectives between the application world and the data world, and that the application world was looking at this data fabric as adding a layer of complexity to this, and whereas the data side is looking at the application world as being black boxes. Yeah. So the last question I'm going to ask to both of you is, how do you overcome basically the mindsets that are on both sides? That one side, let's say the app side's from Venus and the data side's from Mars. How do you overcome that?
I mean, I'll go really simplistic on that one. I think you look at the same, you can completely do the analogy to an organization living in silos. that application data is just about that application, and it makes a lot more sense as you look at across a broader ecosystem and how you join that data and combine that data to get more value out of it. And I know we've all dealt with our own silos inside of our enterprise. I just equate it to the same thing. The more you can get out of those silos and understand what's happening across the whole ecosystem, the more successful you are as an organization.
You know, the other piece that maybe I'll just capstone this conversation with is, you talk a lot about, and SAP talks a lot about the base of customer. And I think one of the things that doesn't come out, but is a great thing about this partnership, is those net new customers that might be considering SAP. This could be an opportunity for onboarding people into the SAP ecosystem, because they're going to have data in other places that they're still going to need to connect to and still need to provide that fidelity to. So this has been great. Yeah, thank you both for taking the time. It's been a great conversation. Great to meet you both.
Enjoyed having the conversation.
Yes, thank you.
And Tony, thanks as well.
And thanks for having me on, Tim.
Yep.